questo è il titolo. Good morning. This morning we have 4 talks, 2 in present and 2 on live. Vediamo quelli on live. And for an hour and 40 minutes until 10 past 11. I thought we would organize it as follows. Each of the speakers will speak for 20 minutes until 10 to 11. Then we will leave the last 20 minutes for question time. And I kindly ask the speakers to try to stick to the time as much as possible. Now, I present Maria Cristina Vendra. The title of her speech is The Horizon of Eco-Imagination and the Force of the Eco-Imaginary, Imagining Ecological with Paul Ricoeur. 1 minute, please. Maria Cristina Vendra is assistant professor at University of Ustinad-Labem. She works as a member of the research project Face of Nature in the Contemporary French Phenomenology, Challenges of New Metaethics and Ecology, funded by Czech Science Foundation and developed at the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences of Prague. She is assistant professor at the University of Ustinad-Labem. Her research interests are in the field of phenomenology and hermeneutics. She published articles on Paul Ricoeur's thinking, in particular about his social thought. She is currently applying Ricoeurian topics and methodology in the context of ecophenomenology and environmental hermeneutics.
Thank you very much for your introduction and for your presentation. And once again, thank you for all the organizer of this great conference. So let's introduce my topic, the horizon of eco-imagination and the force of eco-imaginary, imagining ecologically with Paul Ricoeur. Let's start with a quotation. Imagination, in terms of its matter, is itself carnal. Ricoeur has made a high significant contribution to the understanding of the notion of imagination, from his early project of a philosophy of the will to his analysis of metaphors through his 2 sets of course lectures given in Chicago in 1975, up to his narrative theory, his ethics, and his late work on memory. Ricoeur constantly reiterates the issue of imagination, drawing inspiration from many sources within continental and analytical philosophy, as well as from the broader human and social sciences. His dialogical attitude with different philosophical schools and his ability to mediate among different fields allow him to develop a versatile and evolving theory of imagination whose importance goes far beyond the boundaries of the philosophical discourse. Not surprisingly, therefore, Ricoeur's insight into the dynamics of imagination have stimulated a growing interest among scholars of his thought who have applied resources to specific research contexts, such as literary and social theory, technology and EI, philosophy of mind, and bioethics. Although in recent years, Ricoeur's theory of imagination has been connected to various areas of interest, the possibility to critically insert it in the context of ecophenomenology still remains to be explored. Indeed, recent development in ecophenomenological thinking, emerging from the urgent task to rethink human-nature relationships, have placed considerable emphasis on imagination with reference to thinkers such as Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, and Levinas, but have not yet recognized the potentialities of Ricoeur's work. In the light of this context, the aim of my article is to explain the interdisciplinary potential of recurrent theory of imagination in order to think the relationship with the natural environment. Moreover, despite we assist in the field of recurrent scholarship to an increasing attention given to the topic of imagination in his work, relatively few researchers have focused on his phenomenological treatment of this issue. With this in mind, my claim is that Ricoeurian-inspired phenomenology of eco-imagination must be grounded in his early phenomenology. My presentation has then a very exploratory character. It can be seen as an introductory step into a broader understanding of the theoretical and practical strength of Ricoeur's work on imagination for ecological phenomenology. This tentative attempt to pinpoint the ecological implication of Ricoeur's approach to imagination will be here presented through, with reference to freedom and nature, the voluntary and involuntary, and I will show what kind of connection we can find between his early phenomenology and his lectures on imagination given in Chicago in 1975, but still in course of publication. It will be published next year. My investigation will be divided into two parts. I will focus on Ricoeur's phenomenological description of imagination as rooted in the lived body. From this perspective, imagination has a carnal signification. I will show that this phenomenology of carnal imagination can be powerfully reoriented in ecological terms. Imagination pertains to our mode of being and belonging as relational creature to the natural world. Imagination can be understood then in ecological fashion as carnal eco-imagination, namely as a function linked to our affective and immersive participation as acting and suffering being in the natural environments. The second part will move a step further in considering the eco-imagination as not limited to the representative act of perception, but as a productive force. Ricoeur does not limit then his analysis to the role of imagination as representation, but he considers imagination in terms of productivity. Eco-imagination will be considered as fundamental for the preservation of what we can call the eco-community in which we are situated. I will consider Ricoeur's critical reading of Sartre's connection between imagination and freedom, and Husserl's notion of epoché and imaginative variation in order to think eco-imaginary as forming and meaning bestowing productive dimension. My first part is the ecological significance of carnal imagination. Ricoeur develops his initial analysis on the topic of imagination in the first volume of his phenomenological project titled Freedom and Nature, the Voluntary and Involuntary. In light of the whole development of Ricoeur thought, we can observe that his phenomenology of the will offers us a proto-theory of imagination, that is a preliminary understanding of the role of imagination in our existence as earthly being. If we consider the main sources of inspiration for Ricoeur's theory of imagination, namely Aristotle and Kant, we must recognize that in his early phenomenological approach, he does not yet consider Kant's original account of the powerful role of imagination. His discussion of imagination as an issue involved in the structures of the will is limited to the role of imagination as an operation of reproduction grounded on previous sense perception. It's later, in 1975 lectures on imagination, that Ricoeur will specify once again that imagination is not a shadow of perception, but an ingredient of perception. Following Ricoeur's line of thought, he recognizes that the representational form of imagination is a restrictive model, but the fact that it is a restrictive model does not mean that imagination as reproduction of images corresponded to a faded version of an external reality. On the contrary, he sees reproductive imagination as constitutive of human beings' embodied experience and existence. This leads us to build his idea of carnal imagination. I claim that Ricoeur's account of carnal imagination can be embraced as an opportunity to rethink the relationship between human being and the natural environment, especially as it relates to Merleau-Ponty's notion of la chair du monde. In this sense, the notion of carnal imagination can be coherently understood as having a hidden ecological significance that requires to be disclosed. In the background of Ricoeur's phenomenological perception of carnal imagination, there is the double critique against naturalism and the modern model of the subject. The issues are fundamental for developing a theory of imagination that can be oriented to understand our connection between human beings and the environment. To turn away from naturalism means for Ricoeur to go back to things themselves in the world as they appear to consciousness. So, of course, Ricoeur is inspired by Husserl here in his critique against naturalism, even though Ricoeur does not mention Husserl while criticizing this perspective. Carnal imagination is involved in the operation of consciousness as well as willing, as always directed towards something. Carnal imagination develops through our original openness and immersion into the world. A philosophical approach to carnal imagination can help us to shed light on our bond with the natural environment as a bond of receptiveness and immersivity. Secondly, Ricoeur criticized the indubitable cogito of modernity and advocates an embodied, vulnerable subject. The shift from the modern cogito to the vanded cogito of the relationship between human being and the natural environment is included in this changing. By acknowledging his or her own fragility and finiteness, the wounded cogito has to renounce to any pretension to dominate the natural environment. So the cogito, the subject, is no more the master of nature, is no more the master of himself or herself. We can rediscover ourselves as situated within the natural environment as a context of relations. The discussion of carnal imagination is placed on the cusp of consciousness and bodiness and linked to the rediscovery of what Ricoeur calls the integral cogito. As Ricoeur puts it, the cogito experience, taken as a whole, includes I desire, I can, I intend, and in general, my existence as a body. It is precisely in the description of the first moment of the cycle of willing, that is, voluntary decision, that Ricoeur introduced the concept of carnal imagination. Let us consider this moment of decision and the involuntary correlates in order to disclose the significance of carnal imagination in the context of an environmental philosophy. Human being is anchored in the world through the body, which determines the structure of all experience. It is through our experiences that we can reflect on our localization within the natural environment as needy and motivated creatures, having the capacity to recognize the axiological diversity of values, both organic and social life. The relation between human being and the natural world can be described in phenomenological terms as a detour from the body to the natural world and as a return from the natural world to the body. Carnal imagination plays a fundamental role in this back and forth movement. Our mode of relation with the natural environment is not just one of perception or action, but one of imaginative immersion. Carnal imagination is linked to the body as the source of the most original needs, motives, and values. These dimensions of the corporal involuntary provide the foundation for the voluntary decision. It is through the corporal sensitivity that we can experience the natural environment as a realm of possibilities, allowing for our survival and as well as a context of limitation to our power. Needs. As Ricoeur observes, we are led to seek the crossroads of the needs and willing in the imagination of the absent thing and of the action directed toward the thing. Imagination is embodied and constitutes a response to bodily affection. Carnal imagination is seen as a product of consciousness, resulting from the organic need of something and leading to act in order to get it. According to Ricoeur, need tingers the imaginary with the corporeal. In describing the connection between needs, imagination, and the world, Ricoeur affirms, to feed myself is to place myself on the level of reality of the objects on which I depend. They drag me to the level of objects and make me part of the great natural cycles. Carnal imagination is directed toward an absent thing recognized as valuable. This is possible on the basis of a prior affective bond established between my body and the world. Imagination allows us to anticipate, through imagination, to anticipate the satisfaction or the pain. Imagination as representation of something is a capacity of affective anticipation. The fulfillment of our need would not be possible outside the natural environment and without a maintenance of an internal equilibrium. The second moment is motives. According to Ricoeur, the body is not just the source of needs, but also of primordial motivations. Following his line of thought, motivation is an internal stream that inclines the will to decide for something in order to, as well as because of. That's why motives. Every motive is a motive for a decision that inclines the will towards its projects. As Ricoeur puts it, the circular relation of motive to project demands that I recognize my body as a body for my willing and my willing as a project based in part of my body. We have seen that carnal imagination enables us to anticipate pleasure and suffering. It generates a moment of affection, attraction, or repulsion about an absent thing. Carnal imagination contributes to the configuration of motives. It accompanies the reason for acting in order to achieve something. Carnal imagination bridges our body motives and willful actions within the boundaries of the natural environment. As Ricoeur argues, we are in the world in order to act in it. Imagining the world in flesh is a matter of feeling, valuing, and doing. Values. Human beings' practical involvement into the world leads Ricoeur to the discussion of organic values. The body is the mark of all existence. It is what first reveals values. He explained that since the body is the fundamental source of organic values, all other values are elaborated in relation to the body. The experience of the organic values is a question of coming to terms with our animality and vitality, of facing the fact that our vitality is much a part of us as our relationality, and that therefore we are not above the ecosystem, but we are living members of it. Ricoeur's account of organic values invites us to think the bond between human beings and the natural environment, and to restore this affective connection between us as embodied creatures and other living and non-living entities. In connection to vital values, carnal eco-imagination is not just about projecting possibility from within. It is already a diagnostic in which primal judgment becomes both affective and effective. The second part of my presentation will be about this connection between eco-imagination, eco-imaginary, and how to move from imagination as representation and imagination as production, because Ricoeur does not use the word creativity, but he uses the words production of something. Connected with the desire to restore the importance of imagination as an embodied capacity to affectively and effectively anticipate something, in Freedom and Nature, Ricoeur introduces, though very vaguely, another key concept of his theory of imagination, that of the imaginary. Imagination and the imaginary are described as having a carnal signification related to the perceptive and practical experience of the world. Ricoeur remains here in line with the phenomenological tradition, which is concentrated on imagination as vision and as especially specific mode of seeing the world. In his 1975 lectures on imagination, still unpublished, I highlight this point, he will turn to his point and criticize a theory of imagination limited to vision and representation. In his lectures, Ricoeur develops his analysis of productive power of imagination as an issue that it was already mentioned in his early phenomenological work, Fallible Man, published in 1960 in French. Our attempt to understand the ecological significance of Ricoeur's idea of embodied imagination has to take into account the continuity between reproductive and productive imagination, as well as the possibility to ecologically deploy the concept of the imaginary. The idea of eco-imagination would be truncated and incomprehensible outside the reference to the eco-imaginary. In phenomenological terms, the eco-imaginary can be defined as a worldview in which our embodied experience, as a pattern emerging from the situatedness in the natural environment, describes it and opens up the projection into an imagined future. In Ricoeur's phenomenological approach, imagination and the imaginary are involved in the process of decision, as we have just seen, and can facilitate or obstaculate the realization of a projected action. Following Ricoeur's phenomenological analysis, rather than being an inadequate function to perceive and to know reality, imagination is linked to perception and cognition, and the imaginary is involved in our carnal performativity, in our embodied power to deliberate and act. To imagine is not just to have a mental picture of something, but to display relations. This is a quote from Ricoeur. In an environmental fashion, imagination and imaginary can be understood as dimensions shaping our relationship with the natural environment, including qualities, structures, localizations, situations, attitudes, and feelings. Through the use of imagination and the force of the imaginary, human beings can broaden their understanding of the place they occupy in the natural world and creatively envision a reality different from the one in which we are immersed and formulate new proposals, goals, and ideas. The concept of the imaginary accompanies the consideration of the positive role of imagination. The groundwork for Ricoeur's notion of the imaginary lays in Aristotle, but also in Kant, of course, but also on Sartre and Husserl. Later, in his lectures on imagination, Ricoeur will present 5 lectures on phenomenology dedicated to these two thinkers. He will observe that Sartre and Husserl provided the foundation for his own phenomenology of imagination. Following Sartre and Husserl in rejected the empiricist account of imagination, according to which images are pale copies of perception, and in conceiving imagination as an intentional act of consciousness involved in the circularity between the body and the world. Imagination and the imaginary deal then with the possibility to produce meaningful interactions between our body and the natural as well as the social and cultural environment. In describing the connection between body, pleasure, and imagination, Ricoeur observes, and I quote, "The imaginary clarifies needs and as to its signification, shows its object as other than itself, the itself depicted by a kind of quasi-observation, as Jean-Paul Sartre puts it. As long as an image includes an affective moment, he adds that every image does more than intend the absent object or value generally. It endows it with quasi-presence." Ricoeur follows Sartre's work L'Imaginaire in acknowledging that the imagination is a form of knowing and that the imaginary is the attribute process through which consciousness creates certain objects for particular purposes. Contrary to Sartre, Ricoeur argues that to imagine means to present the absent to myself, not to lack, just to present an absent thing. As he will explain in the lecture, Sartre acknowledges that imagination exposes the subject of experience to nothingness, understood as an absence, existence elsewhere, non-existence and neutralization. According to Ricoeur, Sartre fails to recognize a capacity for mediation between the visible and the invisible within the imagination, and thus, according to Ricoeur, Sartre remains finally imprisoned within the sphere of perception, so within the sphere of reproductive imagination. For Ricoeur, imagination and the imaginary can't be limited to what he mentioned to be the hair of perception. Eco-imagination and the eco-imaginary can be analyzed in the context of imaginary reproduction, but they can be exclusively bound to it. Seen as form of reproduction, eco-imaginary and the eco-imagination allow us to understand our interconnectedness with the natural environment as perceived and as a practically lived space. In his early approach to imagination and the imaginary, Ricoeur is not just inspired by Sartre, but also by Husserl. Indeed, Ricoeur was the translator and the commentator of Husserl's Ideas 1 into French. He had then the chance to focus on the concept of epoché and imaginative variation. According to Ricoeur, Husserl's notion of epoché is the deliberate suspension, not a denial, of the objectifying standpoint of the casual explanation derived from it. Through the bracketing, phenomenology allows to see the world in its immediacy, the world as constituted by living. The epoché enable us to return to things as they appear to our consciousness, to its act and manifestations. The methodological neutralization is linked to human beings' capacity to suspend judgment about the giveness and the reality that surrounds us. Human being has the possibility to deal with reality from a distance, This is a very important point. The point reveals that an underlying continuity also with Sartre's perspective, because human consciousness is capable of escaping the world, because unlike things that are in the middle of the world, the individual consciousness is a being of the world and not just in the middle of the world, capable of extracting itself from the existing present of the given. Husserl's phenomenological epoche is connected to the discussion of imaginative variation, which represent an essential moment in order to attain the essence eidos of a phenomenon. For example, I can imagine changing the color or the material of a desk, having this phenomenon intact, but I cannot remove, for example, the plank of this desk, and still claim that what I perceive is a desk. Through imaginative variation, human beings have the capacity to think reality otherwise. Ricoeur observes that, for Husserl, the imaginative variation was a procedure to test the sameness. So once again, Ricoeur is criticizing Husserl as well as Sartre to be limited to their account of reproductive imagination and not productive imagination. Nevertheless, when we limited the field of reproduction, imaginative variation can still be useful to figure out our relationship with the natural environment, since through imaginative variation we can think together perceptuality, visuality, materiality, constituted our enactment with the world. Through imaginative variation we can intuitively grasp not only our interrelatedness with the components of the natural environment, but also reflect on the richness and diversity. The fact that our imagination and the imaginary cannot just be limited to reproduction does not mean that imagination as a reproduction is to be excluded once again. As we have seen, in the reproductive form, imagination and the imaginary connect the spontaneity of our body with the world. Considered with an environmental perspective, reproductive imagination enables us to perceive ourselves and to act as knots of a larger net composed by other living beings and inanimate entities. Through the use of imaginative variations, human beings can explore the diversity of the natural surrounding. Although Ricoeur does not deny the role of reproductive imagination, he considers necessary to broaden his theory of imagination, moving from reproduction to production. Whereas reproductive imagination is about something real related to perception, productive imagination eliminates the reference to some original in external reality. Consequently, productive imagination refers to an absolute nowhere which escapes the bound of an original in external reality and hence may open a productive reference, namely new possibilities of reality. In its reproductive form, where imaging as an original referent, imagination is a matter of vision and it is inserted in the framework of empirical knowledge. On the contrary, productive imagination produces images that do not have an original referent and requires the language of a fiction. In this context, images are spoken before they are seen. So it's not seen before and then saying, but it's saying and then seeing. As Ricoeur writes, the ultimate role of imagination is not only to diffuse meaning in the various sensorial fields, but to suspend signification in the neutralized atmosphere in the element of fiction. And I will run to my conclusions. In connection to imagination, to language, and not just to vision, we have the possibility to try out new things within a fictional world. Ricoeur allows us to shift the attention from the natural world as perceived to the natural world as interpreted through the use of language. According to him, fictions can produce their own world and enlarge our own. Fiction is not an escape from reality, but a transfiguration of it. Fiction enables us to break through the thickness of reality, to shatter it in order to shape a new one. This break does not mean an opposition between vision on the one hand and language on the other. Ricoeur sees an interaction between the sensible aspect of imagination as seeing as and its productive capacity of saying between the non-verbal and the verbal. But both reproductive and productive imagination bring about an increase in the being of our world. Ricoeur's account of productive imagination can be interpreted as relevant for environmental thinking. Following his line of thought, eco-imagination in its productive form can be described as the experience of grasping the possible futures of place in time's presence. Eco-imagination has a future-oriented direction. It has the capacity to disperse the origin of place by throwing it outward and ahead of time. Connected to the productive power of imagination, the eco-imaginary can assist us in moving towards a more viable or sustainable future, which is yet to be gained. Eco-imagination and eco-imaginary include then space alternatives and temporal openness to what the natural environment might be. The individual and the social sphere of life are both involved in the exercise of productive imagination. The recognition of this point would lead us on what Ricoeurs called the imaginative practices as ideology and utopia. Although the analysis of this concept within the natural perspective is outside the scope of this very short presentation, we can conclude by arguing that environmentalists are engaged in imagining an alternative, even when they do not fully elaborate the proposed alternative. They should hold fast to a utopian vision of a sustainable future articulated in compelling narratives while remaining on alert for unconventional allies and unexpected opportunities for forwarding our agenda. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your rich talk. I find very interesting the relationship between imagination and perception. You said imagination is an ingredient of perception. Then very interesting is also the carnal eco-imagination, very, very interesting. It's embodied, you said. And, if it could be a link in the flesh between my body and the world. Finally, imagination is also productive. This is very important for I mean, to imagine becomes to displace relations. It is quasi-present. It's very important. Is also the question of a possible relation with reality. This is maybe the most important for us in this Congress. Because the imagination on one side and reality on the other, but imagination is not something different. I mean, imagination, when I write understood, is a form, a part of reality, embodied, something that is already reality.
Exactly.
Okay. I go on with Florier Diepali. Okay. His talk is, the title of his talk is, excuse me, Phenomenology of Ego Imagination, Husserl and Think Towards an Aesthetic of the Presentation. I present you. Florier is currently teaching assistant in aesthetic and philosophy of art at Ulm University. He obtained his PhD degree in visual and media studies at Ulm University under the supervision of Professor Renato Boccali. His thesis focuses on the evolution of the concepts of image and imagination in the Husserl's phenomenology and in the application of phenomenological image excuse me, theory to the contemporary visual domain. He was visiting scholar at Husserl's Archive in Köln. His main research fields are image theory, phenomenology, as well as aesthetics. Thank you very much. Okay. I give you the floor, please.
Thanks. Thank you very much for your presentation. In my speech, I'm going to discuss the development of the concept of presentification, Vergegenwärtigung, in Edmund Husserl's phenomenology. In the first part, I present a model that can be approximately derived from the analysis of Göttingen, 1904-1905. This model comes into crisis with analysis on internal time consciousness, which will open a new way of conceiving the relationship between presentation and presentification, which I will discuss in part 2. In conclusion, I try to show how both presentation and presentification, what is present in the flesh and what is given as absent, are fundamental to having an ecological experience of the world. In phenomenology, when we speak of perception, we mean an act of consciousness that brings back flesh objects. Conversely, presentification are acts of consciousness that have the characteristic of returning objects only as if they are present. The main presentification, as you can see, are those articulated according to the temporal horizons. The recollection, the presentification of the present, and the expectation. The recollection is simply a memory of a person. The expectation is the expectation of an expression in an hour. And I can, however, also imagine something that I know is now present, but to which I do not have access to from this very same moment. For example, my house. In one point of the present is, but not there where I am. The latter is the case of the presentification of the present, what Fink defines in terms of Gegenwartserinnerung. Within the presentification, there is we also find the case of the free fantasy, for example, that of a centaur. For this last class of acts, we say that consciousness produces an image, a mental image, that does not currently has a rootness in the real space of perception. Hence, we speak of private and subjective images. I don't have access to what goes in other people's heads. In this sense, Husserl means that in fantasy, objects appear to us in an image, as a mental image. I will not discuss here the case of image consciousness, a particular form of perception. Professor Gygi discussed yesterday about it deeply. Maybe we can discuss later, but in my talk there is no place for this discussion. To summarize, when we talk about presentification, for me, imaginative consciousness in general, we mean the activity of consciousness whereby we put something into image with the so-called mind eye. However, it's one thing to describe the object we see in the perceptual field, which are present in the flesh, and quite another to imagine something with the mind eye. If it is safe to say perception, if is of necessity addressed to the materials present in the perceptual field, on the contrary, mental images are addressed to something that is not there in the same sense that there are objects present in the flesh. And yet, at the same time, they are not nothing. What status do these objects have? What's the nature of these objects that are absent but are nevertheless within consciousness to be considered? And above all, is it necessary every time to insist over the strong ontological difference between existing and non-existing objects? Or can this boundary be considered more blurred? From this conceptual framework, from Göttingen, a situation emerged in which the difference between what is present and what is absent is clearly defined. The content of presentification, defined by Husserl in terms of phantasma, are seen as unreal, unactual, non-existent, opposite from reality, actuality, and existence of the content of perception. This strong contrast between the contents of perception and the content of presentification begins to come into a crisis at the moment when Husserl developed his analysis on temporality. According to Husserlian commentators, I think Ronald Bruzina, Danzavi, the analysis on temporality undermines the entire phenomenological scaffolding that has been consolidated up to Göttingen. In particular, there is a slow erosion of the so-called presentialismus, a conception according to which one is used to thinking of objects as present in the present and absent in the past and the future. Absent objects, mental images, stop to be so vigorously absent when Husserl develops a model of consciousness that is not longer based only on a present consciousness, but on a consciousness that is spread within the temporal horizon of the past and the future. Therefore, there is on consciousness much more space for objects that were previously considered absent within experience. Through the analysis of the present understood as living, what Husserl defines in terms of lebendige Gegenwart, a structure that unites the horizon of the past, present, and future in a single consciousness, a new conception of temporal consciousness come to light that has proven to be more sophisticated than the previous one, 1904, 1905. The new analysis of retention and protension make it possible to show that consciousness, by retaining the content that passes in the direction of the past, queer Intentionalität, also retain itself, length Intentionalität, and thus the present consciousness become a whole with the past consciousness. Similarly, just as consciousness always has retention, it also always has a certain amount of expectation towards the future. So, along with the horizon of the past, it is also given the horizon of the future. Rightly so, because if one did not admit the constant co-presence between a horizon of the past intersected with the horizon of the future, no present would even be imaginable. So that is the point, the crucial point. The present arises from the intersection of these two horizons. In this sense, it's the notion self of the present that is changing. We speak rather of horizon of the present. That is, of a horizon that is flattened together with the horizon of the future and the past in a single unity that constitutes precisely the living present. With this analysis, the problem of what is present and what is absent has waned from an ontological point of view, which means that in Husserl there is no longer the urgency of having to define schematically what is absent and what is present, because consciousness now enjoys preferential access to those dimensions of absence that are consubstantial to it, what is no longer, what is not yet, and what is not of the present. Whenever, just an example, whenever I remember, I do not enter a world of absences, but into a dimension that is totally integral to my experience and that affects my present and my present perception. Contrary to the first model in which Husserl derived presentificating acts from presenting acts as if they were second-degree acts, in this new conception, presentification instead have more dignity. A recollection clearly does not cease to be an absent objectuality if it's compared with the object of perception. That is clear. Simply the relation is not here. The emphasis is not longer on presentificating acts as they bear absent content, but focuses on what they have to bear and which constitutes the experience in its entirety. There is, in a sense, a shift from an ontological way of reasoning to a phenomenological way of reasoning. Ontology dissolves in phenomenology. That means it's no longer interesting to insist on defining these objects, mental images, according to the polarities of what is versus what is not, what is real versus what is unreal, what exists versus what does not exist. But it makes more sense to shift to a more phenomenological attitude. To bring home the point, experience is fairly defined from the present, but at the same time by the dimension of absence that constitute experience in its entirety. As the latest phenomenological production shows, there is an increasing focus on absence. That is, a much more pronounced attention to the dimension of emptiness. Whereas Husserl was very presentialist, tied to the electric material, in the later development of phenomenological production, on the other hand, attention is directed towards the unseen and the constitutive bearing that this unseen has on experience. His student, Fink, for example, had already begun to point out this problem through the concept of depresentation, Entgegenwärtigung. In presentification and image, depresentation, what Fink calls in terms of depresentation, depresentation have the same dignity as presentation. That means consciousness have to forget and to remember at the same time. That is the point. In the Finkian framework, presenting and presentificating acts rest on the horizontality of the life of consciousness. What changes is simply the horizon to which they refer. Recollection refers to the horizon of the past, while perception refers to the horizon of the present. But they are original in the same way. They are not derivated acts. Husserl evidently picks up on this lesson because Husserl uses Fink's concept of the presentation in crisis when describing the constitution of the life world. This attention to absence and what is unseen can also be appreciated in C manuscript, 1932, where Husserl is much more interested in what is lost of experience than what is retained. So in this sense, the adherence to the dream world, to the oblivion, and the sinking of consciousness begins to have more significance. Thereby, it's clear that Husserl begins to perceive the importance of these aspects. That means to the non-being of consciousness. Merleau-Ponty grasped this lesson in its entirety, demonstrating, moreover, that he is well acquainted with Fink's concept of depresentation. It is in this wake that the French philosopher later elaborates the work The Visible and the Invisible. The fundamental idea is that visible and invisible should be taken together because they are equally essential to account for the world, since a world of presence alone cannot be constituted. In particular, Merleau-Ponty will focus on defining the life world primarily from an historical perspective, emphasizing what is not the present of the life world, but placing it in two horizons, what is no longer, what is not yet. This way of thinking, this mental pattern, can be seen very well already in Husserl in The Crisis, when he discusses the constitution of the world. There is here the conviction that for the constitution of the world, it is so important to have the perception of something just like not having it, as was already implicit in the analysis of the thing of space, 1967. What is perceived is just as important as what is not perceived. This is ultimately the reason why presentification, understood as those acts that brings into being that is not into being, are fundamental to the constitution of the world and to having an experience of it. To conclude, what does eco-imagination mean in this framework? At the beginning, we saw that imagination was the faculty deputed to constitute absence, as opposed to perception, which instead delivers presences. Later, we have seen that this idea is no longer sustainable because imagination has been configured as a faculty not only equal to perception, but also as fundamental to the constitution of what is the life world, which is oikos, the home, as Heidegger had already glimpsed. Eco-imagination opens the world in which consciousness intersubjectively find themselves in fundamental communions among each other, their space and their time. This is why, in my perspective, it makes sense to speak of eco-imagination, because imagination is the kind of faculty that contributes strongly to the constitution of the life world, understood as oikos, as an essentially familiar place that binds consciousness to the world and to history, making experience possible. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your interesting talk. I find very interesting the problem of the reality of image and the potential of the imagination act in the apprehension and the importance of this act for the future. I mean, we will see later the question time. Then I go on with Giuseppina Sgueglia. She is online? Or
She is
not?
online, but I
Yes.
will speak for her. Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Di Schiena from Rome, and I'm going to expound on behalf of Giuseppina, if that's as agreed before. So,
Okay.
okay?
Thank you.
Okay,
Yes.
well done.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay,
I present,
now,
one moment, please.
yes,
I have to present her. One moment.
sure.
Okay. Giuseppina Sgueglia from University of Rome, Lateranensis. The title is Ontopoiesis of Psychic Perceptions in both Stumpf and Meinong, and their re-elaboration within a Cassirerian psychological symbolic system of transcendental knowledge. Then.
Okay, so I would be ready to share my screen if I can. I'm not sure if I will manage. So this is, yes, this guy here. Can you see me?
Yes.
Did you copy? All right, well done. So, where's my, so I seem to have problems with my finger. Okay. So in the following paper, we are to examine the account of psychic functions or perceptive appearances present throughout Carl Sturm's 1907 Erscheinungen und psychische Funktionen, with the prospect of identifying the genetic and in sooth near phenomenological aspect of hypothetical components of sensations, and their givenness inasmuch as these come to light as quantitative properties and therefore independent parts with a comprehensive mereological account of psychic experience as a whole. Therefore, we shall firstly stress the fundamental link between this issue and the relational system of intellectual functions or complexions, therefore of higher order objects in the Lotzer-inspired speculative psychology present throughout Alexis Meinung's 1891 zur Psychologie der Komplexionen und Relationen. Along these very lines, namely following the phenomenological evolution, we shall develop a representation of reflective judgments within a material ontology that will enable an attempt to define the core of an ontology of values, so that we can structure an ontopoietic perspective, which, as a matter of fact, will prove to be a transcendental result for an ontology of Stumpfian and Meinungian perceptive system, with the prospect of an investigation of existential adaptive aptitudes of the human species. On the other hand, we shall attempt to re-examine an ontopoietic perspective on the psychological symbolic system of a Vorstellungstheorie along the lines of Hyman Steinthals in 1848, die Sprachwissenschaft Wilhelm von Humboldts und die Hegelische Philosophie, and also attempt to link it to a Cassarerian conceptual perspective and transcendental anthropology of basic phenomena, Grundphänomene. This will in turn allow to investigate Steinthal's concept of a language instinct, as a matter of fact linked to cultural forms analyzed by stressing some kind of condensation of perceived data, so that it will be possible to give an account for the constitution of empirical concepts and to provide a scientific systematization for a progressive connection of objects. Okay, as far as we are concerned, this will provide an ontopoietic interpretation for a new kind of metaphysics to be understood as a mythopoiesis of symbols and an eidetic of culture, possibly to prove of some input. To conclude, we will at the end of the treatment feel enabled to think of the ontological issue concerning the possible relationship between perception and the representation of judgment in terms of the innermost purport of Humboldt's ideale Bezeichnung and an ever more innovative Cassarerian ontology. So ontological descriptive aspects of perceptive judgmental denoting in Stumpf's 1907 Erscheinungen und psychische Funktionen go as follows. Apart from this still precious criticism by Ehrenfels, Koffer, Köhler, upon which we cannot dwell the following, we ask whether those appearances and functions may be the basis for specific hypotheses about gestaltic qualia or qualities. These appearances and functions, where we can envision forms of gestaltic qualia or qualities, are relational aspects, enabling us to imagine some possible coincidence with the category of psychic subjective objectives, as formulated by Meinung in his 1882 Hume-Studien, Volume 2, have in fact a collective object aspect in zur Psychologie der Komplexionen und Relationen, published in 1891, so that Meinung ends up far away from Stumpf. An ineluctable question, though, rises about the purport of those intellectual functions, which, albeit present throughout Stumpf and Meinung, are probably much better characterized in the former than the latter, as symbolic, intuitive, which is in turn to influence Steinton further on. We then ask what sort of objects those psychic appearances and functions hint at or describe, since if Stumpf, following Lotz's Lokalzeichen, seeks for ideal objects, Meinung, also with reference to such objects, rather stresses the inner perception and not so much of acts as higher order objects, which Stumpf never mentioned. With regard to Stumpf, we should mention the relational character of perception in terms of fusion and associativeness by the intellect's activity and judgments concerning the unity of the whole, des Ganzen. The right understanding of my theory of tonal fusion, says Stumpf, and consonance is strictly connected to the separation of relations belonging to the matter of thought, that is, relationing acts, or connecting acts, we might as well say. The correct understanding of my theory of tonal fusion and consonance is strictly linked to the separation of relations belonging to the matter of my thinking from single connecting acts, namely acts of thought, that is perceptions of relations. That is, in fact, our rendition from Stumpf, 1907, quoted in Sgueglia still, 2010, page 635. Moreover, as we may observe, the concept of fusion, Verschmelzung, with Stumpf, which Stumpf builds upon, which Stumpf builds upon, upon which Stumpf builds his use of that of tonal fusion, Tonverschmelzen, is radically opposed to unity, which that concept stands as does resemblance to exchange, to which that concept stands as does resemblance to exchange. In other words, we're not mistaken, if we're not mistaken, that of unity always appears to be an extrinsic thin synthesis, to use a quite Hegelian phrase, also given the markedly intentional character of perceptive and judgmental acts. What is more, Stumpf is knowingly largely indebted to Wundt's physiologische Psychologie. Cassirer, as far as Cassirer is concerned, the question of subjectivity is strictly posed as intensive unity, concreteness of might, and relation to culturally given matters of fact, finalistic relations within individual psychophysical life, retrieving the Herbartian concept of perception. The structure of judgment becomes itself the basis for the validity of perceptive data, within specific expressive forms already providing conditions for objectivity. Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, Part 3, Chapter 1, extrinsicated thanks to the objectifying power of meaning in science. Substance and Function, Part 1, the concept of thing and the concept of relation, Chapter 1, on the theory of the formation concept, passive. Psychic causality, on the other hand, works through the identification of concepts relative to relations between objectivity and subjectivity, calling on the one hand the spontaneity of understanding and the activity of thought, while on the other the construction of an experiential continuity by way of a double correlative form of concepts themselves, which stresses the formal qualities of well-founded contents and ideal relations expressed by consciousness. Now, there's a question of performative passiveness, which of course is a very hot one, as it were, an extremely precious one. Wittgenstein's seeing as does not so much describe a single act, Handlung, as a state, Zustand, in which clearly emerges the aesthetic power of performance due to the concept of shaping, ultimately owing to the denotation intrinsic to expressive acts, as they get repleted by ongoing denotation. There is room in Cassira for a control of objective, and a control meaning an interpretation, of course, of objectivity of form and its expressiveness, not so much following the purporting function of language as searching for the need for expression or for contents of consciousness and their symbolic articulation. The worlds of praxis and poiesis may be seen from perspectives concerning both simple single sciences and in particular and more generally meaning as objectifying and cultural representation. Criticism of metaphysical realism allows by means of a hermeneutic of knowledge to envision possible relations to the phenomenal world in its characteristic form, its own order, its being thus. It is necessary to stress the relation between intentionality as a form of immanent objectivity and objectiveness and the cognitive function shaping objects in their appearance and the interaction with a symbolic form, which ultimately proves to be a spontaneous act of our representational faculty, die Sprache und der Aufbau der Gegenstandswelt, Passim. When the psychological explanation proceeds from the factual elements and the action which they exert in the whole psychic process, it has already taken for granted everything the logical justification of which stands in question. Substance and Function, Chapter 8, on the Psychology of Relations. Theoretical synopsis of symbolic forms, insofar as the process of taking up certain forms, Formwendung, takes on its own structure within sense-giving, Sinngebung. An inescapable theoretical synopsis of symbolic forms is in place, since, lacking any linguistic symbolic representativeness, which in turn presupposes a figural stage in perceptiveness, there would be no such process. In that, Gestaltpsychology truly becomes an antiliteral phenomenology of perception. The concept of symbolic pregnance, insofar as it schematizes a reproductive relation and an idea impression, it is, if not in principle analytical and transcendental, certainly insofar liable to undergo torsions, insofar as given that kind of pregnancy, the discursiveness of understanding only appears confabulated. That is, there's this priors, a symbolic priors, which of course is at the very core of schematization, and subsequently consciousness gives it, as it were, some discursiveness in sheer Kantian terms, which of course in this acceptation may be seen as confabulated. It is possible to provide a genetic interpretation for the transcendental method concerning expression, the conditions of objectivity across manifold fields of intellectual and, most notably, scientific life, within the framework of subjective and objective multidimensionality of data within consciousness, as characterized by native thought. It's about the stratification of psychic experiences about which on which the various scientific areas are based, as it were. The symbolic, on the other hand, is rather to do with the relation between meaning and the fully successful coincidence between exhibition of conceptual function, that is something, and pure intuition, that is something particular. But symbols are but a subspecies of the intuitive, that is also, it is of Hypothesis. See Kant's Kritik der Urteilskraft, paragraph 59. As far as mining is concerned, a categorical ontology is at stake, where relational representations, Relationsvorstellungen, and all representation of a non-categorical ontology complexions, of a non-categorical ontology, namely complexion, following precious neo-Kantian suggestions with regard to the spatialization of objects and the subject's cognitive, epistemological, and axiological ethical dynamics, see Honigswald and Kramer. It is unavoidable to problematize the interpretation of higher-ordered objects in relation to inner perception as synthetic principle as a synthetic principle for a representation of the given as a whole. Sie zur Psychologie der Komplexionen und Relationen, 1898. The representation and perception of what is temporally spread, Zeitanschauung, is not so much the real object or Gegenstand as the content or Inhalt, as continuous analysis and interpretation of representational mirroring on either side given by a representational production, Vorstellungsproduktion of psychic contents. Again, this goes along a gestaltic and chromatic variation on one side, while on the other it's strictly linked to a formal logic of content, both mastering or trying to master the whole and each in a perceptive section or unit. That is our rendition from Über den psychologischen Ursprung der Raumvorstellung, 1873. Meinung clearly stresses the concept of relational mediation, Relationsvermittlung, concerning three classes of content, transforming in judgments about relations according to Locke and his followers, identity difference relations, coexistence and non-coexistence. Meinung also stresses the possibility for a common psychic foundation for the three drawing upon Lotze. As a weak and a strong light are perceived simultaneously, so what springs out of them is not the sensation of a single light being projected, namely the sum total of both. They will rather stay separate. So what we do as we pass from one to the next is become aware of a modification in our state, namely due to the, albeit merely quantitative, higher or lower degree of one and the same impression. Again, our rendition from Grundzüge der Psychologie, 1881, page 23. Then in Meinung's words, starting from a sheer Humean stance, nexuses get unified from a number of 7. Then in Meinung, a number of 7, and increases, in fact, they get increasingly synthesized from an initial number of 7 via the simple opposition of comparison and compatibility, which is already adequate to express sameness or difference, into same attributes regarding different things, attributive individuals, structured by Meinung's in terms of John Stuart Mill's nominalism, in order ideally to identify the nexus between abstractum and concretum, while considering abstracta between general terms. The fundamentum relationis, or fundamentum relationis, stands for matter of fact. Connecting is the power that might objects possess alongside their correlates to take part in the production of that very series of feeling or states of consciousness. Again, our rendering from an abridgment by Roberto Brigatti, entitled Empirismo e Nominalismo Studi su Hume, 1991, page 93, from Meinung's Hume Studien, volumes 1 and 2. Abstraction and confronting are later to become paramount, for instance, in Abstrahieren und Vergleichen, from published in 1900. We would like to stress the nexus between representation of a psychological presupposition for judgment and assumptions as lived experience, or Erlebnisse in the plural, of course, a sort of midland between representation and judgment, for which only beliefless or convictionless judgments are deemed pertinent. See Psychologisch-ethische Untersuchungen zur Werttheorie, 1894. Also see Venanzio Raspa, Segni, espressioni umbratili e oggetti finzionali, semiotica e teoria della finzione in Meinung, page 174. Substitute evidence and supposition evidence, as far as the importance of both memory and inner perception is concerned, are of paramount importance. Erlebnis is apt to mean or meinen an object within and via a directedness towards being. In turn, this directedness towards being via self-perceptive, so according to Meinung, existential judgments, namely an existential judgment.
Excuse me?
It's echoing. It's horribly echoing. Okay, sorry.
Have to go on.
It's,
Excuse me. Could you go
yes.
to the end, please? We are
All
late.
right. It's
Excuse me.
fine. There's
I'm
just
very sorry.
it's fine. It's just fine. So, according to all of that, we might say that intentionality of a given content is extremely is paramount here. Also based on John Stuart Mill's nominalism and considering categorematic terms, as well determined representational contents, and okay, and named all of that, we might say that empirical objects and objects based on the analysis of higher order objects familiarize us with the nature of inner perception, with time of representation, the general particular distinction, and therefore with the Lockean Humean account of abstraction. Abstract and concrete does only mean kinds of representational contents, and in turn, abstract representation turn into individual ones. See Rollinger, 1993, pages 47 to 52, and so on. Okay, and Gemma Yok, of course, 2013. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Fine, thank you.
Okay, very complex talk, very complex talk. Thank you very much. I go quickly now because I have to present now Marco Valerio Di Schiena.
Okay, that's me again.
Grazie al mio amico. Sono Giuseppina Sveglia, ringrazio il mio amico perché l'articolo è stato pensato in italiano e l'inglese del mio amico perfetto mi ha fortemente sostenuto. Grazie.
Bene, grazie. I go on now with Marco Valerio Di Schiena.
Okay.
I present, the title is From Sense-Giving, Anomalies to the Ultimate Frontier, a liminal ontopoiesis in Wittgenstein. Then I say only that Marco Valerio Di Schiena owns a first degree in philosophy, summa cum laude from Rome Sapienza University, and a PhD in cognitive science from Messina. Excuse me.
Okay.
Messina University.
Okay.
He has published both a first degree thesis and his doctorate. The former in Italian is roughly entitled In Creativity and Visibility, a Wittgensteinian Path. He's currently interested in German classical philosophy with significant opening towards phenomenology. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so the introduction I will not dwell so much on, but we are dimly focusing on a set of striking anomalies and paradoxes, perhaps not disjoint from a real antinomy in Wittgenstein's philosophy of psychology, most notably in Philosophical Investigations Part 2. Which is deemed obscure and all sorts, but I think there are today, especially to this day, all the necessary implements to confront this difficult section with confidence, with a certain degree of confidence. So I think we can summarize, and we should try to prove that although Wittgenstein's initial project in the big TypeScript seems to have been that of a reform of language, which is in fact in order as it is. As we know, language is, yes, in order as it is, and yet he wants to somehow reform language in quite a different acceptation than the one we might think. So already in the TypeScript, he deems one such reform impossible, restricting himself to the elimination of those linguistic uses, the conditions on which they make sense have not been examined yet. This typically Wittgensteinian urge to show the actual concrete association of a word with a content, or what might very loosely be called a procedure, is combined with the necessity to prove that each sign is a part of a contextual calculus. That's extremely important. We, throughout the reading of the big TypeScript, we find out that he is trying to work desperately on the notion of a nodal or contextual calculus and try to focus on contextual calculi okay, in order for as it were, we might say syncagrammatic terms to make sense. This in turn rests on ingrained habits, which is both what substantiates the use of words to be brought to visibility or light, and what mostly hinders the possibility to envisage further still possible combination. Yes, it is. Yes, it is, because we see that within a given context, of course, words sort of are enmeshed with one another. Okay, this is not my expression. It's not a phrase I have made up. It's one found by Wittgenstein directly. And since they are already enmeshed with each other, it seems radically impossible both to reform them and to reform this local calculus. But by investigating, of course, the various uses of words, we can see further. That's the basic hint, okay? I'm not saying I'm giving a full account of this, but that's the basic hint. And we can learn this already from the first section of the philosophische Untersuchungen. The appraisal of something as belonging to this or that language game is thus only possible within the peculiar canons fixed by each of the different grammars. Another crucial concept is that of grammar. Hence, whoever shows new nexuses or intermediate cases. Now, this is a very specific phrase he found out, sufficient leader. Okay, we find this sufficient leader. Now, it means a glede is a member of anything. Okay, so sufficient is between. Okay, so it's been very aptly translated into, I believe, intermediate cases. Philosophische Untersuchungen 122, also see the rendition Connecting Links, Wittgenstein 2005, page 308. The reference should be about, I think has to do with, okay, it's to do with the last writings, okay, about the philosophy of psychology, and throughout his of course his diaries, and this very much this notion of connecting links between grammars has quite certainly this notion in a way done violence to the formerly fixed boundaries. But then again, I mean, this operation, okay, does violence. But then again, in its sense, not being recreated, rebuilt, just when a new bound has been marked, starting from which one can codify one's own experience throughout an, as it were, entirely new system of sanctions, according to a new grammar, a new language invented by us. This is again Wittgenstein. We would like to prove that, however potentially infinite that investigation may be, the research has constraints within the combination of possibility of a given term with others included in particular context, and is, as such, always satisfactory, providing it receives ratification or proves liable to receive one within the form of life. We shall also note that an analysis of such possible uses could not be made a priori, but must rather be tried out through sense constitutive boundary line mind experiments or liminal game. On the necessity of such projections of grammar and marginal thinking, a significant number of recent contributions has come from French scholars, while the late Longmont Katalin Neumann has also given an extremely valuable impulse to the renewal of the style and content of analysis of this difficult issue in terms of the sort of creativity necessary to envisage such regularities as those mentioned above. With regard to grammar being, with regard to grammar being a necessary condition for anything simply to be thinkable, and being, despite that, overabundant, since the nexuses grammar fixes, or which are foreseeable starting from it, are not necessary, as they lack any causation power, one can read extremely interesting passages in the big typescript, Wittgenstein's element, that also models of thinking and models and thinking styles, models meaning paradigms, yes, and thinking styles in the sub-languages practiced by the various human forms of life are but temporary. Also, there should be an objection regarding this forms of life in the plural, but there is one single occurrence in Philosophische Untersuchungen, section 2. So we can actually speak of at least one occurrence of forms of life. Das Unhintergehbare, könnte man sagen, seien Lebensformen, is exactly now. I was remembering, was recalling this this quotation exactly from him. No, it's das Unhintergehbare, das Gegebene, könnte man sagen, seien Lebensformen. So, as it were, something which cannot be circled, yes, is the unavoidable, the very data, one could say, are forms of life, which is extremely telling if you think of it. Thus, as it is patent, anything appearing to the derived, appearing as derived from conceptual hierarchies and not yet put under comparative valuation either cannot be taken at face value or it must be excluded. And if new concepts or conceptual notes or aspects modalities must gear with the available grammars and the already played games, then they will have to be proved, at the very least in principle, to be incompatible with those, despite paradoxically being at the same time economically preferable, in accordance to Occam's razor. Also, this is rather counterintuitive, but what I mean is very simply that we find out a new grammar which restructures, as it were, the game. It's a new way of playing the same game. So if apparently the new terms seem not to exactly mesh with the former, this is, of course, to be proved wrong, and we proved right in having found those sufficient leader. Logical analysis thus becomes now inescapably an investigation of grammar. Torsions produced in grammar and new fashions of seeing as are the result of the firmest, of the intellectually most honest willingness to understand, which is ultimately to show how, in fact, unsystematic the system called language is, which cyclically stems from and leads to a deep dissatisfaction with the rules of grammar, eine instinktive Auflehnung. See Wittgenstein, he says this in the big typescript again, and which with language itself. This is what best characterizes innovators who try their best to envisage regularities, and thus the new ways of seeing as are due on their side to projecting, as it were, grammatical models on other such models. Now, let's move on. Wittgenstein furthermore suggests that thinking may have an analogical but analogizing nature, which entails two relevant consequences. It seems impossible to distinguish between a hierarchical way of thinking and an empirically structured one. The objects of our experiences and the connections entailed in the models need a potentially infinite analysis, and possibly only in this sense are they foreseeable. But the analysis is paradoxically always satisfactory, providing those objects can in turn be seen as games in mesh with each other and with those already at hand. Let's move on. Now, what I try is a whole commentary of Wittgenstein. Let's try this. So what is meaning? Surely there's something in language which we can label a disintegration of sense, and which seems to hint at a suspension of a given grammar. Crying hail does not in the least resemble crying hailstone, although a hailstone certainly is a piece of hail. That is of uses, which is a disintegration of uses within a given framework, and paradoxically because of this framework. This is just to exemplify. I examine section by section, yes, so I don't think this is always relevant for our aims here. So section 6 is, along with section 11, of the second part of the philosophical Untersuchungen, one of the most important. It discusses the concept of atmosphere, Dunstkreis, a corona of halo of lightly indicated uses surrounding a word, a familiar picture, and it is of course a very problematic notion. To the things we hear, read, see, there seems to be a halo, an aura in German Hof, of only hinted at past applications and uses, preparing and offering a whole new range of further possible imaginable uses and applications. Wittgenstein points out that the word takes on different characters in different contexts. Thus, all he does is display a great variety of contexts of utterance or offer a not too implicit suggestion for becoming clear of the many contexts of use. That is, of the local calculi, again, or the rules governing that word, which is also hinted at PI 2 paragraph 4. Let's move on and try seeing something spicier, as it were, namely in section 11. Sorry, I went further away. Okay. Now, in these very complex sections, I mean 11 to 14, Wittgenstein points out that as for language in general, even the most immediate kind of perception, namely seeing, is framed around two modalities, envisaging single traits and envisaging resemblances. At stake, there is not just the linguistic codification of what has been seen, but the unavoidable character of some sort of semiotic configuration of perception based on the categories making up someone's sieve. Namely, I mean, what you winnow things through, you know, the sieve. This and the consequent need for analogy do not prevent the aspect switch phenomenon from being fairly seldom found, while at the same time being of the utmost import. If, on the other hand, the subject is a tendency to unite all of one's representations, then the prize is exactly as seeing that something is, or seeing that something is on all, or something is on all, or that's the case for the one experiencing. That something is going on. Okay, that's something you're experiencing, namely. The subject is not hidden, thus not hidden, and the participle should not be meant in a strict acceptation. The subject is never completely intelligible to itself, that's the point, as seen above, and yet it does not fade into the background. It could not possibly do so. Becoming clearer about oneself and one's experience is never to be seen as complete, but is always a capacity to judge in accordance with aspect modalities. An exercise in this ability is thus not disjoint from a capacity for grasping the dawning of an aspect. Hence, it is here a part of sensibility and of a wider ethical, aesthetical region. The very dawning to, along with the aspect, will have actively to be integrated as a twin set of new building bricks within a system of signals and symbols. Further on, we shall see Wittgenstein resolved to investigate.
Yes, we have no time. I apologize again.
Okay, let's go to the conclusion. Okay, aspects as copies act as copies. Hence, they are perceived, envisaged, thought of, and treated as such. Models to which objects perceivable in the future shall be likened. There must be some sense in which such entities are made material. It is neither possible nor sensible to speak of any threshold level in perception. There is neither a pure point of view nor any further qualification. Surely a kind of intellectual empiricism seems to be accepted at this stage, when it looks as if there were no room for such a form of between the ones you have to look for it in another dimension. If there is no room here, there is room in another dimension. Nothing can a priori prove the necessity of a given grammar. According to Wittgenstein and according to what has been said about Denkbewegungen, one cannot help but think in forms, namely in bodies, to which any of your interpretations refer back. And let's go So Wittgenstein draws new ones in section 2, but the conclusions are mainly those I pointed out. I thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Now we have not much time for discussion, but okay. Okay. Have we a microphone? Thank you.
That's on. Thank you for these talks. I've got remarks or questions concerning the first speakers. First of all, Christina, thank you very much for instructive and nice talk on Ricoeur. You've been talking about very interesting issues, I would say. You've been talking on interchange between human and world, between body and world, about circularity and so on, and even on images that are spoken before seen. That let me think on Michael Dufresne, on his concept of affective a priori, on this concept of intersection or even bleeding between man and world. You've been perfectly right when talking about the influence of Sartre and Husserl on Ricoeur. However, Dufresne and Ricoeur were, I would say, close thinkers or even collaborators in some publication projects. So I'm quite sure that you have encountered this relationship, this affinity between these two thinkers, and it seems to me that in certain aspects you've been talking about today, this relation is quite evident. What do you think about it?
Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, indeed, between Ricoeur and Dufresne, there is really a relationship. Indeed, as you know, Ricoeur works on Dufresne work, especially also on aesthetics. And this is especially during the first Ricoeur, like the Ricoeur even before Freedom and Nature, given the context of the war. I would say that it's the same period in which Ricoeur was translating, as you probably know, the ideas won during the war. Indeed, at the Fond Ricoeur, there is the manuscript with the translation of the ideas won in an original copy of the book from German into French. Yes, of course, it would be really interesting, for example, to write something about imagination, not just on Ricoeur, but Ricoeur and Dufresne, and maybe eco-imagination. But of course, it would be another kind of approach, maybe from an aesthetical point of view, and not just from a phenomenological point of view. I mean that the most important point is this kind of circularity through which the notion of carnal imagination can help us to think our relationship with, I'm not using the word nature, but the natural environment, because in my opinion it would be more appropriate. Otherwise, I would use the notion of nature, but with N in big character and not nature like minuscule, like. But natural environment, I would say that it's more appropriate because it includes this relationship between perception, between senses, a kind of multisensoriality of our relationship with the natural environment and with this kind of context. Yeah, images are spoken before being seen. This is a really important point, as you mentioned, because there is this kind of continuation between vision and seeing, between perception and language. And it is like a sort of continuity also in a Ricoeur work, moving from phenomenology to his hermeneutics, moving from perception, phenomenology of perception, or better, phenomenology of the will, because Ricoeur criticized Merleau-Ponty philosophy of perception, and also Husserl. It's a step forward their approach to phenomenology, focusing on will, on human action, towards the sphere of language. There is a continuation indeed between phenomenology and hermeneutics, sort of phenomenological hermeneutics in liquor thought. So thank you very much for your point.
Thank you so much. If I may, I've got one short question or suggestion to Florial. Many thanks for that nice talk. Really elegant. I appreciate it. What was specific for me, or peculiar in a way, that you've been talking about phantasm and showing us a print of Centaur. And that point let me think on Husserl's Ideen Eins, and with that famous passage when where Husserl analyzes Albrecht Dürer, Prince, Night, Death, and Devil, and that analysis was interpreted by other thinkers. Among them, or Roman Ingarden starts his analysis of image with the analysis of this passage. So that passage makes somehow the question even more difficult, I would say, because one thing is phantasm, the other thing is image or work of art we perceive, and like a basic thing or basic issue is presence in the time consciousness. So just a remark, but I'm quite sure that you know that passage. And
thank you very much for your question. That is ideas 1, paragraph 111. We are right. This really no passage, but there is a distinction between fantasy and image consciousness. They are phenomena of time consciousness, but they have different structure. Image consciousness, as Professor Gygi said yesterday, has a threefold structure: a props, a build object, what I see, and a sujet maybe. And fantasy is a mental image, as there is not in my perceptual field. But a point maybe I can emphasize, this idea of image consciousness that appears first in Gotting lessons and then in Ideas 1 is, and I hold it, not a sustainable idea of image consciousness, because the risk here is that imagination come to perception. That is a quite old model in Husserl. The latest manuscript on image consciousness, 1918, Husserl don't use more the concept of neutralization, the concept of image consciousness. Husserl speaks about perceptive fantasie, perceptive sphinctum. There is the idea that perception is already imagining. That is the crucial point. I don't have to imagine to see what I see, but in perception there is already a sort of imagination. That is a crucial point to understand image consciousness. But maybe Professor Gygi can correct me. No, okay. But thank you very much for your question. That is a really good point. That is, for me, for my dissertation, that's what's the crucial point. Mamuka Dolidze said yesterday that also there is a sort of collaboration between perception and imagination. There is no more an empirical perspective. In genetic phenomenology, they are the same horizontalities of consciousness, perception, imagination.
Nobody's? Okay. We have now a break, 10 minutes. And then we will see again here in this room for plenary session. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody.
So maybe we can continue our Congress with the last presentation. I'm really happy that Professor Totaro is here with us. He was here with us from the beginning, and he really contributed a lot to the development of this conference. Thank you for your participation and for your interaction with all the person who attended at the Congress. Professor Totalo taught at the Catholic University in Venice and in Macerata also, because I remember him in Macerata many years ago, 20 years ago. Nowadays he's the president of the scientific committee of the Centro di Studi Filosofici di Gallarate. He's a member of the editorial board of Analecta Husserliana. He worked a lot on the field of ontology and metaphysics, particularly in relationship to the anthropological dimension of this ontology and metaphysics. He devoted several studies on the question of work, and we are really happy to have him here. He will present a paper imaging a new relationship between humans and environment, the role of the eco-phenomenology. Please.
I say that the organizers put me in this uncomfortable position. I'm the last.
Not the best.
But I don't have the presumption to conclude. I'm the last, but I'm not concluding. Because this Congress, in my opinion, was very rich of many topics and many positions, also contrasting. And so we can have this representation of our Congress in the next volume of Analecta Husserliana. So, Renato Boccali said the title of my speech, Imagine a New Relationship Between Humans and Environment, the Role of the Eco-Phenomenology. I would like to start by taking up the metaphysical character of the phenomenology of life elaborated by Anna Teresa Timienieszka. Thanks to this original turning, phenomenology becomes a recognition of a process of realization of being, or anthropoiesis, that includes in an unitary way all the manifestation of life up to the evidence of the divine, passing through the moment of recapitulation and relaunch constituted by the human. I have present, above all, the last work of Anna Teresa Timienieszka, The New Enlightenment, The Case of God. Timienieszka, we know, loved Heraclitus, who inspired the terminological, I think, passage from being to beingness. That is, being from the point of view of a dynamic metaphysics. From my side, I would also like to remember Parmenides and his statement, the being cannot but be, or the being cannot not be. In short, being is not nothing, where being negates the nothing, so that the nothing is only functional to affirm the positivity of being, is only a signifying that makes evident the undeniable signification of being. So, Parmenides declares, in my interpretation, the unconditioned positivity of being, or the being as unconditional. Thus, we can recognize the unconditional being as the primal ground of any conditional being, that is, the being within the conditions of time and space. According to Jürgen Habermas, we are in the era of post-metaphysical thought. Nevertheless, Habermas himself is aware of the relevance of the intentionality referring to the entire or to the whole, das Ganze. The relationship to the whole would not be satisfied by a sort of scientism and not even by specialized knowledge. So it needs, in my opinion, a general philosophy, or it hints at a post-metaphysics, which should not be detached or separated from the world of life. It is clear that ontopousis constitutes itself as a new metaphysics, because it aspires to be an active search for the ultimate sense of reality, as Tymieniecka said, the ultimate sense of the reality. Consequently, a research into the sense of sense, that is, of the ultimate sense, must open itself to a renovated consideration of the unconditioned principle, which is the legacy of classical metaphysics. A principle like this has also to be considered alive and intrinsic to the life, therefore leading all the process of life in truth, goodness and beauty, until the manifestation of both the fullness of God and the fullness of the life in God. Before the completion of this fullness, the unconditional being always gives itself to us within the limits of our condition. The being that happens within the field of our experience is inadequate to the fullness of being. The truth of being consists properly in the full manifestation of every being, and for this reason it is a goal that has yet to come for us. The fullness of being can only be approximated through multiple perspectives that converge to the same point of attraction. Perspectives can also imply oppositions, conflict, and an apparent lack of harmony. Within the difference between unconditional being and conditional one, we can appreciate the message of salvation by religions. Listening this message means the introduction of a relationship between persons, that is, between a person who has the capacity to save and persons who need to be saved. in order to realize the fullness of their ontological dignity. This requires that all things and everybody are in God, without exhausting God. That leads us to say that salvation regards not only human beings, but the totality of beings, like animals, plants, and everything that is a part of the environment. The unity of everything that is alive and of the environment too does not allow the confusion between what is on the way of its fullness and what is already the fullness. We have to stress the idea of a difference, the concept that can give account of the difference is the notion of transcendence. Transcendence does not mean setting a world behind this world, as Nietzsche denounced, but seeing this world on the road to its fullness, a fullness that God is already. We do not need a causal paradigm to explain the relationship between God and beings that are in relationship with God. We have to live the relation cause-effect to the so-called positive sciences, and especially to the physical mathematical sciences. The modern pantheism is based on the idea that there is a total equation between the cause and the effects, and how precisely Spinoza said, in the effects there should be the same perfection that there is in the cause. Deus sive natura, with the necessity and the determinism that it implies, is depending from the scientific pattern of the first modernity, a pattern that the quantum physics, with the introduction of probabilistic or stochastic logic, has overcome. In any case, we have to have a big caution facing the metaphysical extrapolations of the physical cosmological science, when it presents itself as a metaphysical knowledge. In other words, we should not let depend the affirmation or the negation of God on the experimental knowledge of the Big Bang, and we should not arrive to think that God could have her place in a black hole. The concept of transcendence of God should protect us from transpositions like that. Furthermore, the space of the difference allows to think the autonomy of all that is conditioned in the relationship with the unconditioned being. The latter, contrary to what is believed, often believed, can be the ground of our freedom in choosing within the sphere of the limited realities, like political institutions and the connected normativity. The absolute sense of unconditional being is the basis for the recognition of the relativity of all that is different from it. There can be no short circuit between absolute and relative. Unfortunately, I can't dwell on this issue. Within the space of the difference, which we have traced above, we have the responsibility to bring ourselves, Earth and cosmos, to a complete fullness in God. We can see here the deep reason for the task and the role of an eco-phenomenology. Such a task not only involves the intentionality of knowledge, it also implies practical attention. Indeed, the deep meaning of praxis is to tend to a manifestation of being that does not yet appear to us. That is, it consists in making happen for us the being that is for itself. This kind of praxis or of action is not just any practice, but can be qualified as an ontological one. We say that the phenomenology of life and anthropoiesis as a new metaphysics share the idea of the positivity of being. The positivity of being deserves care regarding not only the human being, but also the environment in which humans are situated in a relationship that is not static. Humans constantly change the environment, and reciprocally, the environment changes humans. Recent modeling of this relationship implies that the environment changes humans who have previously changed the same environment. The result is a system of blows and backlashes that grow on themselves. This growth is not positive when it can be destructive for both humans and environment, the latter being constituted by things, plants, and animals in a manifold variety of species, the biodiversity. The increase in human needs and the improvement of desires that have to be satisfied, thanks to the exploitation of all that is not human, is a trend that involves a development that knows no limits due to the uncontrolled extension of economies, mainly private or state capitalism, and the enhancement of technologies. The protagonists of a process like that are certainly humans, but at the same time, all the non-humans are provoked to unprecedented processes that are unforeseen by humans, in a measure that is incomparable with the characteristics of the past, so that we are used to describing them as abnormal. Really, what we attribute as norm to non-human nature depends on our interpretation of it. From an epistemological point of view, indeed, we have to highlight that our theories about nature are not nature itself. If we add a practical point of view, it must be said that what is now declared as abnormal in nature depends in a growing measure on our behavior towards nature itself. All that brings us to ask in a new way, what is today the position of the human within the earth and cosmos, to take up a title of a famous book of Max Scheler? And in any case, I believe that we cannot adopt a model of an already done harmony. In fact, the manifold manifestations of life have been always characterized by competition and conflict too. Plants within the process of growth compete for a better position to the light and the sun. Non-human animals struggle against other species in search of nourishment. And within the same species, for sexual and generative supremacy. Human animals have always been engaged in destructive conflict as well as in peaceful competition. For their part, the earth and cosmos are shaken by cataclysm that incessantly deny their stability and involve, to a greater or lesser extent, every manifestation of life. Furthermore, we cannot ignore the fact that humans, besides domesticated plants and animals and rendering them edible, have also had, throughout history, to guard against the harmful effects of plants and from the unpredictable behavior of animals. Humans are now the winner at the expense of plants and animals, to the point that plants and animals need to be protected by humans. Nevertheless, the human fight against bacteria and viruses belongs to a longer duration. Compared to a structural disharmony, at present we are responsible for an additional disharmony. But at the same time, we are pushed more urgently by the idea of harmony. Starting from the awareness that we are responsible for a deeper and guilty disharmony, to not to say of the sudden disharmony introduced by a war about which we do not know neither the end nor the possible enlargement of its catastrophic feature. We can only foresee that a nuclear catastrophe would throw our philosophical consideration, also of World Phenomenologic Institute, in the garbage jar. Within this scenario, eco-phenomenology cannot be a simple superficial makeup of phenomenology and ontopoiesis itself. We have to pass from an instrumental intentionality towards the earth and cosmos to a loving intentionality. So we need a stronger power of our imaginatio creatrix to turn human intentionality towards the non-human environment, living and not living including. A turning like that involves a deep change in imagining our way of life. We certainly need new theories, but we need previously the elaboration and the diffusion of common imaginaries, which are the indispensable and vital background of theories. Charles Taylor had good reasons to highlight the interweaving between a social repertoire of shared imagines and of usual practices that are always connected with imagines before any theory. New imaginaries are already on the field, especially in the recent generations. Unfortunately, the gap between old and new generations represents one of the serious splits of our time, and it can determine in young people dangerous attitudes of exit from political commitment and from the system of democracy, after and despite the action of protest and the flames of indignation. Not only we cannot persist in the actual way of development and growth, as the theorists of the degrowth, see Serge Latouche, have long argued, but we have to measure the persuasion that a different way in producing and consuming would be an advantage for individual and collectivity. Life could be happier and more satisfying thanks to renouncing social patterns based on the unlimited growth, simultaneously featured by predation and waste of resources. In a paradoxical way, the Hegelian use of reason could give us a surprise linked to the negativity of the current war, which is teaching us that resources are limited and is forcing our style of life to pay more attention to goods that are worthy to be produced and to be consumed. Perhaps we could be forced to have more intense interpersonal relationships, provided they are not exhausted by digital communication processes. Unfortunately, a negative push, also when it obliges to change the previous habits, is not enough to introduce positive virtues, which require a pulling factor, that is, an attraction by something is experienced as a better way of life. In the direction of a good path is open at a structural level by the actuations of the circular economy and the diffusion of the civil economy in a more general frame of ecological transition. What could be a good strategy to respect and to love all that is non-human and cannot be considered only as a value of exchange, and not even, if we want to be radical, as a value of use at the exclusive service of humans? In my view, we have to recognize above all the otherness of nature towards us. It does not mean that nature is something alien to us, and not even disowning that humans are also the result of an incessant hybridation with nature. Roberto Marchesini explained that we are children of nature, but a mature relationship between children and parents needs a fair recognition of difference and detachment too. To put it in a few words, we cannot identify ourselves with the extra-human nature, and we cannot flatten nature upon us. Nature, as well as the environment around us, is not a mere prosthesis of mankind. Recognizing this distinction, not separation, distinction, is the first step in renouncing an attitude of appropriation, which is an attitude of exploiting towards non-human life. We must pursue behavior to preserve and safeguard the otherness of nature. In this direction, we can also be interpreters of the rights of nature, considering the goods of nature from animals to plants, forests, rivers, lakes and mountains, as both individual and collective quasi-persons. Rivers, I say. Quasi-persons who speak to us through our own language, but over their needs, which are irreducible to needs that are strictly human. The extension of rights to the natural goods also implies that they are always considered, we could say with reference to Kant, as subjects endowed with intrinsic dignity, quasi-persons, and never just as simple objects reducible to useful tools for our needs. It is not so much a matter of extending the characteristics of the anthropos to the environment, but of recognizing the proper characteristics of the environment. That are also the lines, in my opinion, of an integral ecology expressed in the Pope Francis encyclical Laudato Si. Last but not least, at this aim, a specific anthropological change is required to go beyond the present one-sidedness of a humankind who, as Hannah Arendt outlined in The Human Condition, represents himself only as a worker. And we could add, as a worker, producer, consumer. It is important to have a measure of the work so that to integrate the ability to work with the ability to act and to contemplate. That integration can give origin to good actions to preserve and safeguard nature and environment, no longer reduced to an exploitable matter. Particularly, contemplating means to take nature and environment as a gift that is given to us before any claim to use them for producing and consuming. Pursuing the harmony of humans with the earth and the cosmos urgently requires such a change. An anthropological harmony that is a right balance of human abilities is a necessary premise of a more general harmony. Enrichment of the sense of a human being means giving sense to the earth and cosmos for which we are responsible. Eventually, the imaginative faculty can inspire mental and practical abilities to reform and transform life contexts. We need a strong change, both in representing the non-human environment and in reshaping our attitudes towards it. This is the bestowal of sense to which we are called for a sustainable future.
Thank you. So it was a perfect conclusion for our Congress. This is why we put you here at the end of the Congress. But we have a little time. We have time for questions. So please, if you have any question. We are a little, yes. Professor Dolise.
Thank you, Francesco Totaro, for your very interesting article and report. I have only one remark about your text. That is that when you mentioned the instrumental intentionality and loving intentionality, I think that intentionality, if we restrict intentionality by the instrumental tasks, instrumental aim, in any case, the intentionality would be distorted. And loving intentionality also means instrumental intentionality, because love to love is also some aim, some restriction of intentionality. If we allow intentionality to flow in itself without any external aim or external task, we cannot know what is it. This is a loving intentionality or other. Loving intentionality thus belongs to the instrumental intentionality, to my mind. Or if you share the theological position, in this case, loving intentionality means to intentionally toward Christ, toward God. That is my remark. Thank you.
It was a little complicated for me. Did you not answer very well?
Yeah. He said the core question was the difference between intentionality and love intentionality. This was the point. You want you to focus on.
Yeah, there is an analogy with that Kant said about the respect of human. When Kant said that we have not to deal with any persons only as a tool, but we have always respect the human within us and in other persons, always as an end, as a goal. So not only as a tool, but not only simply as a tool, but always also as a goal. Of course, we have to avoid to put in an absolute contrast these two phases of the question, because the instrumental intentionality is, in a certain measure, unavoidable. Is that happens also between persons. But if the instrumental intentionality is not the prevalent attitude to the other human, so this is a behavior of virtue. And so we have the same ability to be virtuous facing in relationship with non-human. Non-human can be reduced, can't be reduced only to a tool for our needs, for our desires. We have to think that not all that is not human have an intrinsic dignity, And this dignity means that we have to drive the non-human to the fullness of its proper dignity. It's a question to respect being in every what is. Every being has a proper dignity, and we have to drive this dignity to a proper fullness, which is distinct, which is not the same, the identical for us and for others, for us as a human and for that which is not human. So our ability, our virtue would consist in the love of the fullness of every being. This is a new kind of ethics that we have to be able to construct.
Wait, we cannot hear. We need the microphone.
In state of freedom, unlimited and unconditional intentionality becomes it loving intentionality, because it is driven towards the valuable aim of love, that is the fullness of the being. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But I have to add that a fundamental element of the Anna Teresa Timinieska's reflection. This element is the orientation to God, because God is the absolute richness towards we have to put our actions and our way of thought too. The importance of God for Timinieska, in my opinion, was fundamental, and we risk to ignore the importance of the orientation to God, that it is very important in the books of Timinieska.
Is there another question?
Maybe I can do just a little
Yes.
question. You said in your presentation that ecophenomenology cannot be considered as a make-up of phenomenology, and then you develop your argumentation. My question is, have you an example about this make-up of phenomenology? In which sense eco could be a make-up of phenomenology?
No, this is an enterprise that we have to be able to put in the way, with an efficient result. I think that I didn't be able to follow all the parallel sections. I hope that in this parallel section there was something of propositive, of constructive, behind the limits of phenomenology, which is not yet an eco-phenomenology. In eco-phenomenology implies a turn respect to the simple phenomenology, because it implies a task of building new situations in many fields of our existence, in architecture, for example. Architecture, in digital domain. Because we have to solve some ambiguities which are present within the digital domain. Digital domain can drive us to an alienation in favor of means, of new digital means. Contrary, digital domain can become for us a tool, an occasion to have a richer communication. And so this domain can be a resource for us or a reason of dependence. So, ambiguities like that are present in many domains of our existence, which is different from times where Timienieckas started to think phenomenology of life. Our life is more and complicated, and we have to become able to analyze the new domains and to drive these domains towards a good goal. And so, for this reason, I think that we are starting to think the reality in which we live in a different way in comparison with the old way to think and to practice phenomenology of life. Now, our ethical task becomes more urgent in comparison to the past. I think that the old way of phenomenology wasn't very sensible to the ethical domain. There was a sort of minor importance devoted to the ethical domain. Now this domain becomes, could be the first domain to where we have to insist and converge.
Any other question? Daniela?
I would like to thank Professor Totaro for his vision. We need visions, and I agree with his claim for new imagings and practices. I think that this is the level, the principal level in which we have to move, to which we have to move. Since all the traditional evidences are broken, are broken, and now we have to construct again from the ground, from the grounds. Construct again from the grounds. As in the historical process happened, humans began from fantasy, from mythos. And now we need a new exercise of mythical imaginations. And wherefrom a new kind of reason and of phenomenology, a mature phenomenology, can arise. So many thanks, many thanks. Okay.
So I agree, of course, with this consideration. And no, I have to underline the importance of this turning, because we have not solutions already available, and we have to construct, to build, to give goals for behavior, for attitudes. And so we have a very large task to accomplish. And in this sense, eco-phenomenology can't be only a make-up of phenomenology, because it involves a change of categories, of images, and a creation of myths in the deep sense of the word. Nietzsche, for example, insisted about the importance of myth in comparison with a dead reason. Reason risks to be something cool. we need a warm reason, a reason that have the task to embrace also the other dimensions of life, like affectivity, like emotions, but it remains the task, the specific task of reason, that is the task of orientation, because affectivity, imagines, myths are to be always interpreted, and well interpreted, and are always to be oriented to the right goal. Differently, we can risk a dispersion of affectivity, of passions, of everything which is human, but human. We have to see human in progress towards a goal, towards this ultimate sense, which is done for us and to us, that is godness as the fullness also of us who are not God.
So maybe if there is no more question, we can thank Professor Totaro. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for closing in this way our Congress. Daniela, if you want to come a little bit here. it's quite late, but I think that we need a few minutes for concluding this Congress. I want to thank every one of you participating to this conference. I want to thank Daniela, Giulia, and Florier for their wonderful participation and useful presence. I want to thank our technicians that helped us every day for the sometimes difficult problems that we had, but at the end we arrived. We are lucky here in this university for the presence of technicians and the Ufficio Eventi. Thank you very much for all. Thank you. As I always say, you are the diamond of the crown of our university. And before leaving, I want to stress the fact that we will recollect all your papers. We are planning a publication. As Maya said yesterday, the publication is very hard, so we need a lot of time, a lot of work, but when we arrive at the end, maybe we will send you an email before Christmas for all the deadline and so on. Maybe we can ask you if you can give us the paper before May, the end of May. Will be a good moment. After that, we will start the process, all the process necessary to arrive at the end of the publication, and we will meet. I hope next time. I don't know where, but to continue this discussion.
In 2 years, we can organize maybe another conference. The 67th International Congress of Phenomenology, but we need two years.
Yeah, minimum.
Minimum. 2 years minimum. So I say you goodbye, and I was very pleased to meet you, all of you. Known person and unknown
person. New person.
No people and new people. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Have a nice journey to your home and see you next time.
Yes.
Next conference.
Next conference.
Bye.